The Ghost of the Lake. I had always avoided coming back to the lake house. It was a place full of memories of summers filled with laughter, the warm sun on the water, and the sound of my mother's voice calling me from the shore. But more than those happy times, the lake was where my mother had drowned, where I had lost her. That memory haunted me. After her death, my father sold the house, and we never spoke of it again. But now, years later, I had inherited it after my father's passing. I wasn't sure what to expect when I returned to that house by the water. The thought of seeing the place where my mother had drowned made my stomach twist in knots, but something inside me told me I needed to go back. To face whatever I had been running from all these years. The house was smaller than I remembered. The once bright yellow paint was now chipped and peeling, and the windows looked as though they hadn't been cleaned in years. The garden, once my mother's pride and joy, was overgrown with weeds. Yet the lake was the same, calm, still, and eerily silent. I walked inside, the floorboards creaking under my feet. Everything was covered in dust, as if no one had set foot inside for decades. It was like walking into a time capsule. There, on the mantelpiece, was a photo of my mother and me. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of life, and I looked up at her with adoration, her hand resting on my shoulder. I stayed the night, thinking it would be easier than leaving right away. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The house seemed to hum with an energy that I couldn't explain. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my room, but when I got up to check, there was no one there. The next day, I wandered around the property, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. I hadn't been back here in so long, but it still felt like something was watching me. As I stood on the dock, looking out over the water, I thought about my mother. The day she drowned had always been a blur to me. I was only 8 at the time. Everyone said it was an accident, that she had gone swimming and gotten caught in the undertow. But something about that explanation had never sat right with me. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A figure standing at the edge of the water, her long dark hair flowing in the breeze. I blinked, and she was gone. But the feeling remained, the cold, sinking feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I dreamed of her. She was standing in the water, her arms outstretched, calling my name. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, I went into town to ask some questions. I wanted to know more about what had happened all those years ago. I visited the old local library, where I found a few articles about the drowning, but they didn't tell me much. Everyone seemed to accept that it was an accident. But something didn't add up. My mother was a strong swimmer. She had taught me to swim in that very lake. How could she have drowned so easily? I talked to some of the older locals, people who had been around when my mother died. Most of them gave me sympathetic looks, their eyes filled with pity. But one man, an old fisherman who had lived by the lake his entire life, hesitated when I mentioned my mother's death. People around here don't like to talk about it, he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. But your mother's death wasn't just an accident. There's something about that lake, something that ain't right. I pressed him for more, but he shook his head and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, the visions began again. I saw her standing in the water, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. This time, she wasn't alone. There was another figure, a man, standing behind her. He reached out, and then, she disappeared beneath the surface. I woke up gasping for breath, my heart racing. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had happened to my mother, something more than an accident, and I was determined to find out what. Over the next few days, I searched the house for anything that could help me understand what had happened. I went through old papers, letters, and photographs, but nothing gave me the answers I was looking for. Then, one night, as I was going through my mother's old belongings in the attic, I found a box hidden away in the corner. Inside, there were letters from someone I didn't know. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the tone of the letters was urgent, almost desperate. As I read through them, a chilling realization came over me. My mother had been having an affair, and whoever she had been involved with was not happy. The letters became more and more aggressive, threatening to reveal their secret if she didn't end it. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. My mother hadn't drowned by accident. Someone had killed her, and they had made it look like an accident to cover their tracks. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had written those letters was still out there, watching me, waiting for me to uncover the truth. I took the letters to the local police, but they didn't seem interested in reopening the case. It was too long ago, they said. There was no evidence, no leads. But I knew I was onto something. The visions grew stronger. I saw my mother every night, standing in the lake, her eyes pleading with me to help her. The man in the shadows became clearer, his face twisted in anger. And then, one night, I saw it all. I saw him push her into the water. I saw her struggle, her arms flailing as she tried to stay above the surface. And then, she was gone. I knew I had to find out who he was. I went back to the letters, looking for any clue that could lead me to him. Finally, I found a name, James. It was only mentioned once, but it was enough. I asked around town, but no one seemed to know anything about a man named James. It was as if he had vanished, leaving no trace behind. But I wasn't about to give up. I dug deeper, looking through old records and asking anyone who might have known him. And then, finally, I found him. James had been a local businessman, well known in the area. He had moved away shortly after my mother's death, and no one had heard from him since. I tracked him down, finding him living in a small town miles away from the lake. Confronting him was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I needed to know the truth. When I finally found him, he looked nothing like the man I had seen in my visions. He was older, frail, and his eyes were filled with regret. I didn't mean to kill her, he said quietly, his voice shaking. It was an accident. We were arguing, and I pushed her. I didn't mean for her to fall into the water. His confession sent a wave of relief and anger through me. I had finally found the truth, but it didn't bring my mother back. She was still gone, and nothing could change that. James was arrested, but the years of guilt had already taken their toll on him. He died in prison a few months later. I sold the lake house after that. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer. But I like to think that my mother is finally at peace. The vision stopped after James was arrested, and the lake no longer feels haunted. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see her standing there, on the edge of the water, waiting for me. I couldn't let go of the feeling that something more remained hidden, even after James's confession. Yes, he had pushed her, and yes, her death was no longer a mystery in the eyes of the law, but the unease within me lingered. It felt like a part of the story was missing, like the lake still held on to secrets I hadn't yet uncovered. I had sold the house, but before leaving town for good, I returned for one last visit. I stood on the dock, staring at the spot where I had seen the visions of my mother. The water was so still, so calm, it didn't seem like the kind of place where life could be lost so easily. I thought about the conversations I had had with the old fisherman, the whispers about the lake being cursed. Could there be something more than just the physical circumstances of her death? As I stood there, a breeze ruffled the surface of the water, creating ripples that stretched out toward the middle of the lake. I suddenly felt drawn to it. Without really thinking, I walked to the end of the dock, the wooden boards creaking beneath my feet. I knelt down and looked into the water. For a moment, it seemed like I could see something beneath the surface, something moving. I don't know what compelled me, but I dove into the lake. The water was cold, much colder than I expected for a summer day. As I swam deeper, the sunlight faded, and the world around me became murky and dark. I kept going, though, as if something was pulling me further down. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I was close to something important. And then I saw it, an old chest, half buried in the mud at the bottom of the lake. It was small, no bigger than a suitcase, and rusted from years of being submerged. I reached for it, my fingers grazing the cold metal, and at that moment, I felt a hand grab my wrist. I gasped, water flooding my mouth as I panicked. I looked around, but there was no one there. Yet I could feel the grip tighten, pulling me away from the chest. I kicked and struggled, managing to break free, and swam as fast as I could to the surface. I burst through the water, gasping for air, and swam back to the dock, my heart racing. When I pulled myself out of the lake, I sat there shivering, my clothes dripping wet, my mind racing with confusion. What had just happened? Had I imagined it? Or was there truly something, or someone, still down there, guarding whatever was in that chest? I knew I couldn't leave now, not without finding out what was inside. The chest had to hold some answer, some final piece of the puzzle. But how was I supposed to get to it? I spent the next few days preparing. I bought diving equipment, hired a boat, and made sure I had everything I needed to retrieve the chest from the bottom of the lake. I wasn't sure if it was safe to go back down there, but I didn't care. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. The day I went back into the water, the lake was even quieter than usual. The air was thick with tension, as if the lake itself knew what I was about to do. I anchored the boat in the middle of the lake, directly above where I had seen the chest, and lowered myself into the water. This time, I was ready. I swam straight down, my flashlight cutting through the murky water, until I saw the chest again. It was still there, half buried in the mud, but this time I wasn't going to let anything stop me. I grabbed the chest with both hands and pulled. It was heavier than I expected, but after a few tugs, it came free. As I swam back to the surface, the same cold grip I had felt before wrapped around my ankle. I kicked and twisted, but it held on tight. Panic surged through me, but I kept fighting, refusing to let it pull me back down. Finally, with one last desperate kick, I broke free and shot to the surface. I gasped for air as I climbed back into the boat, dragging the chest with me. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I had done it. I had the chest. I wasted no time prying it open. Inside were letters, old photographs, and a small, ornate box. The letters were addressed to my father, and as I read through them, my world shifted. They were love letters, from my mother to someone else, but not James. They were written to my father's brother. I sat there in shock, the weight of the truth crashing down on me. My mother had been in love with my uncle. The affair with James had been a cover, something she had used to hide the real secret. And when my father had found out, it wasn't James who had confronted her by the lake that day. It was him. I realized now why James had seemed so remorseful. He had thought he was the one responsible for her death, but he had been wrong. My father had known about the affair, and in a fit of rage, he had pushed her into the water. James had simply been there afterward, trying to make sense of it all. I opened a small box inside the chest, and there it was, my mother's wedding ring, the one she had been wearing when she died. My father must have taken it from her that day, a symbol of the love he had betrayed. I sat there in the boat for what felt like hours, the truth swirling around me like the cold water of the lake. My mother's death had never been about an affair or a mistake. It had been a crime of passion, a dark secret my father had taken to his grave. I left the lake that day for the last time, the chest and its contents buried deep in the water where they belonged. I knew the truth now, but I also knew that some secrets are better left hidden. As I drove away from the house, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. My mother's spirit was finally at rest, and so was I. The lake, once a place of pain and mystery, was now just water, still, calm, and silent. But deep down, I knew that the lake would always hold the truth. And some truths, like the dark waters of the lake, are better left undisturbed.